You are listening to an American Free Press podcast.
Joining me on the line on this American Free Press podcast is G. Edward Griffin, who heads up Freedom Force International. That's one of his current most prominent activities in the freedom fight. He, of course, is known for writing the well-known book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, about the Federal Reserve, A World Without Cancer, and The Fearful Master about the UN, his most notable works. Thanks for joining me, Ed.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Mark. It's a pleasure.
The Freedom Force International Conference, Global Warming and Inconvenient Lie, I was able to cover it for AFP there in Tempe, Arizona, early December 2016. I'll tell you, that was certainly a balancing, you might say, adding balance to the narrative about global warming. I learned so much there, and I thought I knew quite a bit. The speakers covered a lot of ground. They went at global warming from educational and media and technical angles. They really dissected it. There was even a gentleman that spoke about geoengineering, weather modification, something that some of us don't always hear about or think about. Certainly it doesn't appear in the mainstream press. But it really left me with a treasure trove of information that I'm just now getting written and published because I want to make sure I get it accurate. And what you've told me, though, when we've spoken off the air, is that it's important what goes on at the Freedom Force International Congress, this having been the third Congress in early December in Arizona. But what really matters, you were saying, Ed, was the way the information from the conference is then channeled and published and put out there in a way that you're trying to bring about better policy in the United States and the world. I thought maybe we'd start with that.
Yeah, that's a good place, Mark, because I imagine your audience is pretty well informed about these things, and anybody that gets informed about when I say these things, I'm talking about items of great importance to the future of our country and our families and everything. So when people get tuned into that aspect of reality, there's an urgency that wells up in most of us that, hey, we have to get this information out. More people have to understand this. We have to do something about it. So it's that urgency that drives this all, I think. It's not just an interest in more information or desire to become better informed, all of which is important, of course, but it's this urgency that we have to change the future, or otherwise it's not going to go well for us. So the conference that we're discussing here that was held in Phoenix a couple of weeks ago on this global warming fraud was very informative for those of us who were there. And I agree with you, Mark. I thought I was pretty much on top of this game when I went. It was my idea in the beginning, and so I was thinking, well, I'm going to get this information out and let everybody know what I thought I knew. And all of that happened, of course. But like you, I was blown away by the wealth of information that these experts brought with them. As you mentioned, there were several scientists, there were professors at universities, there was, from well-known universities, and they're from all over the world, from the United Kingdom and from Canada, of course, the United States. We had journalists and teachers and researchers, and what a great team of people put together. And they brought with them so much information and knowledge that now we're sitting on this. And I'm thinking, what are we going to do with this? We had our Congress. We had a lot of people there, but that was peanuts compared to the world. So the idea now is we go into full gear, and we have been editing all that information that was recorded very nicely, I might add, by our video team. Very nice images and good, clear audio. Everything is looking very professional. And we're editing it, getting all of the dead space out, and making a very nice album. We've referred to it affectionately as our weapon of mass instruction. And we don't know exactly yet how many DVDs are going to be in there, but probably about 8 or maybe more. And so it's going to be a massive thing, but we're determined to get it out to the world. And the information will be broadcast live on the Internet. It'll be like a streaming broadcast. We'll do it many times over the months ahead, and it'll be free, and we just want everybody to know about it. And so we'll be conducting a series of promotional campaigns to notify everybody of the dates of the broadcast of these events. We think that it's probably going to be viewed by a lot more people if we have a specific event, a date and a time, rather than just putting it up on YouTube or something and saying, oh, go look at it, by the way. It's always going to be there at your leisure, you know. Well, when people tell me that I got to or should look at something at YouTube, it's the first time I have a few moments to spare, you know what happens? I never get a few moments to spare. So
yes, I know how that goes.
I'm not alone in that one. So our idea is that we'll have definite dates and times and then notify everybody that these are the dates and the times, and by golly, put it on your calendar and go watch them. So anyway, we have seen this sort of thing done before in similar high important events, and it's amazingly successful. So we're going to do that, and we're hoping that eventually when we come out of this, we will have reached many millions of people. And in this way, this is how the alternative media, such as we are, can begin to get around the block that's thrown out there by the establishment media. So that's what the plan is, and I'm really excited about it because I've been looking at the edits of these presentations as they're being done, and I'm looking at it again for the second time. I was there at the event, and now I'm seeing things that I completely missed when I was there, and I'm really, well, I hate to hear people use the word. I'm excited because I think it's overused, you know, but in this case, it certainly applies to me. I'm very excited about this project and can hardly wait to announce the time and the date. So now I guess I should follow this up by saying if anybody listening in would like to know when these dates and times are scheduled, just send me an email. Let me know of your interest, and you can send it to, well, let's see, the best way, here's a better way. Better than an email, go to the website. And the best way to get there is www.inconvenientlie.com. That's www.inconvenientlie.com. And that'll take you right to the page that describes the event and also will announce the dates and the times.
Do you know when the first date might be, or approximately?
Well, approximately. We're shooting for the end of January, and I think we're going to be able to make it. Now, I think the editing is going to be done by then, so it's a question then only of scheduling the technical facilities to make sure that it does get broadcast and that we have enough bandwidth, because if we have tens of thousands of people all wanting to click in at the same time, obviously our little servers are going to be overused. So we have to make sure we have some very high powered servers that can deliver that kind of programming. And that's really about it. And of course we have to have a little time to get the word out. So if anybody would like to help us to participate in getting the word out, please let me know of that interest. If you have any mailing lists that you think are, pretty good size, and you think that people on those lists would be interested in this information, you could help us by participating in the affiliate program that we're putting together, and make it worth your while to solicit your people and let them know of this. So it's all well thought through, and unless there are some really ugly surprises, I think it's all going to work out really well.
Yeah, what I wrote about, and I wrote about it because it was one of the more interesting things, although all of it was very notable and all had its own relevance, was Lord Christopher Monckton. And that story that I wrote appeared in the first edition of American Free Press for 2017. And the hard copy version. I believe it's going online at AmericanFreePress.net. But what he said was of particular note, that for every doubling of CO2, when the establishment scientists and the establishment media talks about doubling CO2 levels in the atmosphere, that they use a flawed math. They have bad math, simply put. And if you don't correct the math, for every doubling of CO2, it shows the temperature going up something like 10 or 12 degrees Celsius. But Lord Monckton at your Freedom Force conference in Phoenix said if you correct the math, for every doubling of CO2, at most you get 2.7 degrees. Most likely you're going to be under 1.0 Celsius. So that alone, you just take that one little slice and think about the fact that they're botching the math. I mean, once you mess up the math, then everything, the dominoes fall, and just about everything's going to be in error from that point on.
Yes, well, they botch everything up. It's not just the math. They botch up the data that goes into the math. They botch up the assumptions. Let's just take assumptions, for example. The assumption is that CO2 is a pollutant. It's something to be afraid of, something to get rid of. Oh, my gosh, get rid of the CO2. It's terrible. It's like garbage in the stream, you know? Well, there's an assumption that is totally wrong. CO2 is one of the life-giving gases. The scientists in our conference were showing clearly that right now the Earth is in a CO2 deficit. It's the lowest that it has been in millions of years. And life was originated on this planet in a much more CO2-rich environment than it is now. And life is to thrive with much more CO2 than we now have, not just plant life, but human life as well. Humans really thrive as well as plants, although plants need CO2 and humans exhale CO2. Still, CO2 is vital in our environment as well. We could breathe many, many times more CO2 than we now have, and it wouldn't be toxic. In fact, CO2 is not toxic at any level. The only reason you might be afraid of CO2 under any conditions would be if it replaced oxygen. You know, in other words, if we had 100% CO2, we would die because we wouldn't have oxygen. Not because of the CO2, but because of the lack of oxygen. That's the only thing we have to worry about in CO2, and we don't get that. We are told that, CO2 is the big evil thing. Look, it's got carbon in it. And my gosh, carbon is the substance of our bodies, and, you know, on and on and on. So they botch up everything, including the assumptions, the math, the data. Oh, my goodness. Do they love to mess up the data? In other words, you know, if any one or two things were messed up like that, you might say, well, these guys are in error. Sure, they're scientists and they're experts, but everybody makes mistakes. But, you know, when you've got one mistake on top of another mistake, and these are supposedly experts, and the information is so readily available, you come, unfortunately, to the conclusion that these are not mistakes. These are lies. And then you start looking for, well, why would they lie? And that's where it gets really interesting, because we find out that this is not really a scientific issue at all. This is a political issue. And these lies become the basis for huge political reforms, as they call them, changes in society that are going to put us all into the gulag. That's what it adds up to. And we're all supposed to be happy about it, because all of this loss of freedom and these crushing taxes that are coming down supposedly to solve global warming, all of these things are really the political agenda behind this, and they don't want to admit that. So they keep talking about, save the planet, save our children and our grandchildren and so forth. And we get so wrapped up in the emotional appeal and all of the propaganda and the pictures of floating debris in the ocean, and we think, that's global warming. You know, all of this deception, and it's very effective. So we're supposed to be so wrapped up emotionally in these appeals that we don't look at the end game, which is this global gulag that they're trying to build for us. So that's what the conference is all about. That's where the information inexorably leads in that direction. And I defy anybody to break that open and say, in other words, what I'm saying, I defy anybody to show where any of the facts that we're presenting are wrong. And it's easy to show where most of the facts presented by the global warming alarmists not only are wrong, but they're deliberately wrong.
What I found particularly interesting, Ed, as a media guy also, was when I first got to the conference, I had the assumption in my head that whatever media bias, and it's a very strong bias in favor of the politically correct global warming narrative, the Al Gore school of thought, whatever media bias there might be in that favor is relatively recent. I was shocked because I never paid attention before when news clippings were shown on a documentary that was shown at the beginning of your conference that Friday evening. And they might have been repeated in other people's presentations, but news clippings were shown of Walter Cronkite and the other old school journalists who we thought were a little bit more straightforward, a little more balanced. And that was back during, at least partly during the global cooling scare. We can't have just global warming. They have to scare us to death with, an ice age as well. And during the global cooling scare, which was the earlier rendition of this fear factor, this politically motivated fear factor that you're talking about, the talking heads on TV were just as biased back then and just as prone to exclude any counter argument as they are now. I thought the total bias might have started in the 80s or the early 90s, or, how naive am I? They were on the side of establishment science and not allowing any counterpoint in way back in the 60s and 70s.
Exactly, yeah.
And so this, as you've told me off air, this idea of treating the populace like one big collective, and these collectivists that are using the inconvenient lie of global warming for a political motive, as you're outlining, this obviously goes back a number of years, and so they've been working on this psychological element that the media plays. They play a psychological role. They've been working on this a long time. Even though Al Gore and the global warming and all that seems relatively recent, but it goes back further than I thought. I found that very interesting.
Yeah, the technique of scaring people into surrendering their liberties and their financial independence is as old as the hills. You can go back to Machiavelli, probably before then, but when I was working on my book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve, I had occasion somewhere in the meanderings of that historical thread to deal with Machiavelli's book, The Prince.
Yes.
Because he was giving advice in that book of how to stay in power. And he wasn't saying, and by the way, this is not in defense of Machiavelli, but my preconceived idea was that Machiavelli was an evil person who was suggesting that that rulers deliberately lie, cheat, steal, and murder and all of that sort of thing just because that was fun or something like that. But when I actually read the book, I realized that this Machiavelli guy was offering his services to just about anybody with a palace that would take him in. Anybody would take him in and feed him, and supply him room and board and all that stuff. It was kind of a replica of a lot of intellectuals today that offered their intellectual services to anybody that will feed them.
So he was an early consultant. I have to interject that. He was a consultant.
Or early scientist or something looking for a grant, that kind of thing. But anyway, in this book, Machiavelli was just saying, look, this is neither good nor bad. If you want to stay in power, this is what you have to do. Because otherwise there are people with equally clever ideas, they're going to depose you and kill you. So if you want to stay in power, this is what you have to do. And one of the pieces of advice, of course, we've all heard it, is that if the population starts to get restless because they don't like the crushing taxes and the rules and regulations that you're imposing on them, that the best way to handle that is to get involved in a war. Just pick a war, pick somebody you think you can beat up on and start a war. And do your best to make it a really horrible war, so long as you're pretty sure you can win. But drag it out and have this awful war going on so that people back home will be more concerned about the threat of your enemy taking over than they will be about the reality of you already taking over, So this concept of scaring people into not objecting to the status of their current government is as old as Machiavelli, and it goes, as I say, goes before him. So there's nothing new about it at all. And one of the best ways to scare people is warfare, of course, with a physical enemy. But how about warfare against forces of nature? You see. Now, this is a new twist. This is war against the global warming. Oh, isn't that something? I mean, a war against terrorism, that's sort of a human thing. A war against crime, that's a human thing. A war against pornography. We got all these wars going on, and everywhere you turn around, there's something else to scare the the daylights out of us. And if you look at the solutions in every case, the solutions to all of these horrible things that we're told about is more government power and more taxes and more regulations. And wouldn't you know, who do you suppose benefits from all that? So I think people ought to start being a little more skeptical about some of these wars. And now that doesn't mean that there aren't real threats, but what it does mean is that very clever people can find a real threat and either make it worse, deliberately make it worse, or at least propagandize it so that it seems worse than it really is. And that's what we have to look out for. Yeah, well put. It's true. And what you say there that I want to stress is particularly important, that if you say it's something that, our industrial and agricultural and other atmospheric emissions are causing it, yes, there's a human element, but yet the threat of global warming is almost like an asteroid barreling in or something almost beyond our comprehension. It's not an army marching over a hill. It's something a little bit less tangible. And so we can all be convinced or tricked into having this huge feeling of uncertainty, and then almost by default, or just shrugging it off, we say, fine. Yes, let's have the carbon tax. We just don't want to take any chances that the oceans are going to boil or that all these other terrible things will happen in our natural world. So people kind of acquiesce because it's no longer a real tangible enemy. And exactly, yeah. Yeah, the unknown is the most fearful thing of all. And especially if it's unknown, then science writers like Al Gore, science fiction writers, I should say, not science fiction writers, let's get that straight, like Al Gore, can write almost any scenario they wish, and people will say, oh, yeah, I guess that could happen, couldn't it? So it makes it easy for these guys. Yeah, now one of the things that occurred to me since I spoke to you last was a lot of people on the side of the issue where, they really believe man-made global warming is fully for real and that it constitutes a clear and present danger. I think that one of the things they say, and this is my personal opinion more than anything, is that, that must mean then that you're fully for crude oil, that all you care about is burning coal. You think crude oil and coal are the best alternatives. And my answer to that, I'm just speaking for myself, is just because I'm skeptical of global warming doesn't mean we should stay hooked on crude oil forever. It doesn't mean I totally disbelieve in alternative energy and things like that. I think one of the things the Al Gore crowd, in lack of a better word, one of the things they try to get away with saying is, therefore, all of us people that are skeptical, we must own a lot of stock in oil companies. We must fully believe that coal is the answer. But my response to that, at least, Ed, is that just because I'm skeptical of global warming in terms of its conventional explanation doesn't necessarily mean I'm against alternative energy exploration and finding out what works and what can work efficiently and cheaply. How do you see that issue? Well, exactly. I think that you're right on target with that, Mark. Those are two different issues. And one of the things that I have to acknowledge to our opponents in this issue is that they're very clever. And one of those elements of cleverness is that they tend to lump a lot of things together that really don't belong together. And this is one of those issues that you don't have to be against alternative energy. In fact, all of us, I think, are for alternative energy if it can be proven to be really reality and not just some gimmick to get government subsidies into a particular industry, tax everybody until they're broke so that we can support a windmill industry, for example, and tell everybody that the windmills are paying their own way when they're not, that the taxpayers are being forced to subsidize them, and all of these gimmicks that they use. So I'm all for alternative energy, just like you are and most people are, but I also am all for being objective about what they cost and make sure it doesn't become a political boondoggle for siphoning taxes into the political cronies of those in power, which often becomes the case. So we tend to get blinded by the emotional aspect of this thing, so we don't look at other agendas might be going on behind the scenes. So anyway, you're quite right. I think that this is an issue that we have to get clear in our mind to separate out the fact that, boy, I wish I had a lot of stock in Exxon and so forth. I mean, but that's said with tongue in cheek, of course, because I do believe in social investing and all that, socially conscious investing. But no, nothing wrong with making money on energy or anything else if it's an honorable investment and you're not cheating anybody out of something. You're not lying or anything. But if it's a real investment and it can pay its own way, I'm all for it. I have my questions about coal, soot production and all those toxic things. But, I was interested in – I just saw a video the other night of a presentation made by Patrick Moore. Now, Patrick, we tried to get him to our conference, and he wasn't available. I wish now we had really been successful, because I didn't realize what a scientist he really is. I knew he had scientific credentials, but he's really quite an accomplished scientist. And now Patrick Moore, I'll try and make this short. He's attributed as one of the founders of Greenpeace. Actually, that is true and not quite true, because actually he was one of the founders of Greenpeace in Canada. And he's as a young fellow, he was in the forefront, one of the what we would call the hippie types, one of the leaders, the pioneers in the environmental movement. He doesn't say so, but who knows what groups he was hanging out with. It looked like a lot of those kids were having a lot of parties along the way. And that was, frankly, before my time. A good thing, because I might have been pulled into it. But anyway, Patrick comes from that crowd, and we saw pictures of him riding those little rubber rafts, confronting the Russian fleet and confronting the whaling vessels and all of this sort of thing. So he was a real environmentalist back in the day when there weren't many of them around, and he became one of the founders of Greenpeace of Canada, and was instrumental on the board of directors of all these groups within that cluster, and became a very powerful leader in Greenpeace, and finally walked away from it when he realized that this real environmentalist movement had been taken over by politically motivated people who were no longer really interested in the environment at all, but we're now just using it for promoting a political agenda, like we're talking about. So now he broke away, and then he gave this lecture that I saw the other night on CO2, and he really jarred me, because he was actually making the case that we're all against carbon pollution, and rightly so. He said, I certainly was and still am. He said, but what I didn't realize in the beginning was that all of the pollution that came out of these smokestacks from the carbon-burning generators included more than carbon, but all kinds of really toxic stuff. And it was this other toxic stuff, not the carbon, but this other toxic stuff that was killing people and damaging plants. And that's the stuff that we should have been focused on, but we weren't. We were focused on this thing called carbon. And he says it turns out that they have ways now, and we've got rid of all of this toxic stuff. It doesn't come out of the smokestacks anymore. All that comes out now is water vapor and some carbon. And he says, thank God for the carbon, because we have to replenish carbon back into the atmosphere, or we're all going to die. He said the thing we all worried about years ago, we're all going to die because of too much carbon. He said it was just the opposite. Is the planet is starving for carbon right now. We need more carbon in the form of CO2. He said we're practically to the bottom edge now of the survival level of CO2 in the atmosphere. We need more carbon. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what a turnaround in my thinking this is. And I have to, check this out for myself. I'm not going to just take it because Patrick Moore said it, assume that it's correct, but it sounds correct. And I think that, these are the things we have to be open to, the fact that we have been hoodwinked. And once we get down to the nitty-gritties and begin to understand the chemistry, which they don't want us to do. They want us just to be operating on some kind of a emotional level. But once we understand the chemistry and listen to these people, Patrick does not work for the coal industry. He's, probably one of the lifelong opponents of fossil fuels and so forth. But here he is admitting that he had to change his thinking on a very important thing, and that is that the burning and releasing of carbon carbon into the atmosphere is a very important thing, that we need more of it and not less of it. And boy, what a game changer that was for me.
Indeed. Yeah, I ran across some information where burning coal, to some limited extent at least, will release some mercury into the atmosphere, and that there are other considerations. But it's interesting how the hyper-environmentalists behind the conventional global warming movement don't talk about real environmental concerns, but always the ones that really don't hold any water and that are largely just a mask for some political agenda. But to take it to another level very briefly, and then we'll get into a couple other quick topics, it's interesting, too, that we've had a scientific community that not only gives us a lot of one-sided, unreliable information, but also has kind of a larger deceptive element to it. You know, Thomas Edison is the eternal hero, but Nikola Tesla is rarely discussed in academia. Tesla even talked about the possibility that there's a background free energy. And it's interesting also that the environmentalists never mention him, because if there is some way to harness free energy, at least to a limited degree, that would be the most environmentally friendly thing you could think of. But you notice he's not mentioned. And in fact, most of the scientific community doesn't even want to acknowledge Tesla's, tangible contributions to society, such as AC current instead of DC current, and so on. So real environmental things don't seem to come across their screen. Do you hear that?
Yes, that was. I'm sorry about that, but
That's
I forgot
okay.
to turn off my cell phone.
Oh, that's all right. But what I'm saying in a nutshell is that real alternatives and real environmental concerns, on top of everything else, don't seem to be important to these hyper-environmentalists.
Right, you are. Well, yeah, because they're not. The environmentalist movement has been captured by politicians. That's the bottom line. So even though they are wearing hats that say environmentalist on the hat, they're not. They're politicians. It should say I'm a politician. And it's hard for people to look past the letters. They say, oh, he's an environmentalist. No, he's not. He's a politician. And that's the thing we get clear on.
Or at least an environmental politician or a politicized environmentalist. But the politics takes precedent, no doubt about it.
Yeah, that's their motive.
It's just interesting how Nikola Tesla and all that he has contributed, and how much more we could take from his research, how much that's put on the margins or just flushed down the memory hole. He's kind of an unsung hero in my mind. And it's just very curious that his contribution is so, given such a short straw, you might say, given such little importance.
Yeah, I think Tesla is a very interesting character. I'm certainly no expert on him, but I've got several books in my library that every once in a while I've thumbed through those pages, and repeatedly I'm amazed at some of the technology that he apparently was into that is still ahead of our time. So, yeah, what can you say?
Yeah. The free energy angle is something that's curiously missing from these environmentalist handbook.
On the issue of free energy, it's one of my little favorite hobby topics. As I say, I'm not an expert, but I'm attracted to it. This idea of free energy is, it's based on a misinterpretation of the word free. There's nothing free. But free energy in the common sense in which it's used today is certainly not new. It's not a new idea. You can't even scoff at it. If free energy is defined as energy that you don't pay for, it's everywhere. I mean, windmills are free energy. You stick some blades up in the air, the wind blows through them, it turns the rotors, and you've got electrical power coming from the generator. It's free, except for the payment of the device, the rotating devices, and so forth. The first form of free energy was when the sailors stuck a cloth across a couple of sticks on their boat, and the wind came along and moved the boat. That's free energy. Free energy is everywhere. And so just because you can't see it and nobody's put a meter on on it yet, so that you have to pay for it, doesn't mean that it isn't there. And that's what Tesla is talking about. He says the universe is full of different forms of free energy in that sense. And some of them we haven't discovered yet. We think we know all about wind. We think we know about electricity. And we think we know about gravity and all those things. But there could be other forms of energy out there that we haven't yet tuned into, and that's what Tesla's talking about. And if we ever do tune into those other forms of energy, there'll be a way to make them free. So that's all this is about. The free energy is not a mysterious thing. It's not perpetual motion. It's just freely using the energy that's moving around the universe. All we have to do is stick our sail out and catch it and move along with it.
Yeah, and my main point is how the environmentalists behind the inconvenient lie of global warming are so silent on what would be solutions or potential solutions that are obviously fully in harmony with nature and would present no discernible environmental degradation whatsoever. What that does is it shows how much more of a fraud they really are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I've run into some cases where people have been working on improved battery systems and improved solar energy collectors, better solar cells, and they've told me that they're getting opposition from the establishment, that they've been told to back off. I said, well, why is that? And I ask in total incredulity, knowing full well what the answer is. And some of them look at me as though I'm crazy for even asking, because they know that there are people that don't want this kind of energy because it'll interrupt the status quo, which is very profitable to the oil companies and to the electrical utilities. If you can imagine that there was something that you could stick on top of your house, an antenna, let's say, I'm just making this up, stick up an antenna and hook it up to the circuits in your house, and you'd have all the electricity you want. What do you think the utility companies would think about that invention?
Yes, they would have a very low opinion of that. But as if we needed more proof, that really shows the hypocrisy of that whole environmental movement that is promoting this global warming narrative. Now, moving on, just a couple more items here as we summarize for today. I know you've written a lot about the Federal Reserve. You mentioned your Creature on Jekyll Island book a little while ago, The Creature from Jekyll Island, excuse me. I went to Jekyll Island in 2010, the 100-year anniversary of the famous train ride of those well-known duck hunters who wouldn't know one end of a gun from the other. And it was an interesting place to see. Since then, I've seen bills come and go, audit the Fed, end the Fed, end the Fed. All of those bills seem to mysteriously take a dirt nap, if you'll pardon the expression, very quickly. The Fed has a way of killing any legislation that would get beyond the first set of doors. If you think about the Maxwell Smart scenario, anybody that goes beyond the first or second set of doors gets their nose pinched pretty hard if you're a congressman. What is it going to take, Ed, to rein in the Fed and expose it in such a way where people can be convinced that maybe this thing needs to go the way of the Edsel? I mean, Jeb Hensarling, he's currently the head of the House Financial Services Committee, no longer called the House Banking and Currency Committee. He's got this bill out there that the House passed. It was never signed into law. It may be renewed now that the 115th Congress was sworn in yesterday on January 3rd. I'm not sure if they'll renew it. But all the bill is that, yes, the Fed's independence is important. Yes, its monetary policy should not be politicized, but we need more openness and transparency on the way they arrive at their monetary policy. They need to give us more of a sense of how they get there, even though the Federal Open Market Committee meetings where they set monetary policy are closed even to the president. This legislation is trying to say, yes, they need their independence. They don't need to be politicized, but the Fed needs to be more open on how it arrives at its monetary decisions. Now, that sounds kind of half-hearted, but that's the latest thing. So what it really is, how do we get at this Fed monster in such a way? Where is the sensitive part? Where is that part of the Death Star where it's hyper vulnerable to any kind of pressure? It seems like that's the thing with the Fed. How do you get at this thing?
Yeah, good question. But the first step is to recognize that the Fed is what it is, and it's not going to be changed. it's like saying, well, that the lion really shouldn't be so vicious. It shouldn't go around eating little helpless animals, and we have to tame the lion somehow. Well, the lion, you could possibly put it in a cage, but it can always get out of the cage. Somebody can leave the door open. As long as the lion is the lion, it is a lion. And we have to recognize what the Federal Reserve is. It's not a government agency. It's a banking cartel. It's a cartel, ladies and gentlemen, no different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel or sugar cartel. It's made up of the private banks in the nation, and it has one purpose only for existing. And like all cartels, that purpose is to further the advantage of the members of the cartel. Has nothing to do with protecting the people or improving the economy or stabilizing prices or anything else. It has one purpose, and that is to benefit the members of the cartel, to benefit the banks, to serve the banks. It is made up of people who represent the banks. It's the banks, the banks, the banks. So it'll never be anything other than that. And the idea of, well, we have to give the Federal Reserve System some way to be controlled. No way. The Federal Reserve will never be controlled as long as it is the Federal Reserve. Now, if we controlled it, it wouldn't be the Federal Reserve anymore. The idea, it's like if we killed the lion, it wouldn't be the lion anymore. That's true. So anyway, we have to be clear on the fact that we're not going to change the cartel. As long as it exists, it'll be exactly, its purpose will be exactly what it is today. Now, the big question that you brought up is how do we deal with it? Well, maybe we can never get rid of the cartel, but we can certainly we can defang it, let's say. We can take away the monopolistic power it has over the money supply. Is there anything in anybody's mind that can justify giving a banking cartel a monopolistic power over the nation's money? Would anybody in their right mind say, yeah, I think that's a good idea. Let's give the banking cartel the power to issue United States money, not the government, not the people. Let's give it to the banks. They'll issue the nation's money. Okay. And not only that, we'll have a law that forces everybody to use that money or go to prison. That's the core. That's the fang of the Federal Reserve. We have given it the power of government. It's a private institution, but we've given it the power of the government itself. That's what the Federal Reserve Act did back in 1913. So now if you don't obey the rules that are produced by that private banking cartel, you go to prison, which is why people think it's a government agency, is because it has the power of government. The power of government was given to it by the Congress. So that's the problem right there. You can let the cartel exist, but if you take away the power of legalized compulsion away from it, then it will no longer be able to do what it does. If people aren't forced to use Federal Reserve notes, if they had the freedom to choose, let's say, any other monetary system, a private system or another government's monetary system, they could use Disneyland coupons, whatever they want to use for money. If they had the freedom to do that, then the first thing people would be using other currencies, especially those that are backed in gold and silver. They would be using those currencies instead of these fiat things called Federal Reserve notes. And instead of losing purchasing power in their money day by day, they would be having a stabilized or increasing purchasing power in that money. The first thing the cartel would just go out of business because it wouldn't be able to pay its way. It wouldn't have any profit there. So that's what we have to do now. The next question is, how do we do that? And that's not going to happen unless there's a change in the law. In other words, the Federal Reserve Act has to be abolished. How do we do that? Congress has to do that. How do we do that? Got to get rid of the congressmen that are there, because those people are servants to the Federal Reserve System. Not every one of them, but I'm going to guess over 90% of them would never dream of doing anything that would run contrary to the best interests of the Federal Reserve, because they know, politically they know, they're instinctively savvy that if they did that, it would be the end of their political careers. So we need to replace those people. They're not going to change either. They know who their masters are. They know which side of their toast has the butter, and so they're not going to change either. So now we finally come to the nitty-gritties. We have to change the nameplates in Washington. Now, how do we do that? We have to do that by educating the American people to the reality that we're discussing now, so that they understand the trickery that's going on and won't fall for it anymore. How do we do that? Well, We're doing that right now on this radio show. It's part of an educational crusade that we just have to continue carrying on. Until that is done, nothing else follows. But once that educational mission is accomplished and enough people understand the reality of the Federal Reserve, then that first domino will fall. And after the first one, I think they'll all go click, click, click very quickly, and we'll wind up with a free monetary system once again.
Yeah, it does have to come full circle. I believe that's largely correct. Otherwise, it's spitwads hitting the side of a battleship. You know, these audit the Fed bills, these end the Fed bills. There just isn't enough of a groundswell, based on what you're saying, to get anything more than a spitwad that hits the side of the Fed battleship. Yeah. And yeah, there needs to be a much broader realization. Of course, I would personally tie that into the need for the alternative media to grow, and the already damaged mainstream media, where the real fake news comes from, for that to shrink. And I think we're seeing signs of that. The credibility of the mainstream media, the fact that that credibility is sinking, thereby makes it more possible to bring, more significant changes forward. And one of those changes would be the groundswell that would repeal the Federal Reserve Act. So I guess we have to look at pushing back on the mainstream media and getting the alternative narrative out there as a key to the kingdom, if you will, and that includes ending the Fed eventually.
Yeah, very good point. I think, Mark, you remember at the conference itself that took place in Phoenix, one of the speakers was Alex Newman.
Yes.
And he's a journalist, and I liked his idea. He said, let's quit calling this the mainstream media. He said, it's not. We are the mainstream media. The only trouble is that they have the money and they have all the major outlets. Let's just call them what they are. And I think his choice was to call it establishment media. I like that idea. Quit calling it mainstream, because it does not represent the mainstream at all.
Yeah, they're more like court jesters. They're the court media, would be
exactly.
Another way of putting it.
Mm-hmm.
Because everything they report seems to be predicated on the idea that the system we have now is sacrosanct. It must not be too disturbed. Yes, you can make some noise, but we don't want your noise to go anywhere. You have to be the man in the wilderness screaming against the Fed, but no one's going to hear you. And I think that's their main weapon is sheer the sheer circulation, the sheer omnipresence of their message, their ability to get on every television set, their ability to get a newspaper in every airport and all around you. It's not the quality of their message, it's the quantity, and that gives everyone the impression that that must be the correct media, that must be the people that have all the answers. It's like psychologically and commercially overwhelming us. I think that's what it comes down to. So, yeah, I mean, Congress does have the constitutional prerogative to create a currency interest-free and not let the Fed create money as debt. Is that not correct?
Well, of course. In fact, they have the obligation to do that. That's part of the Constitution. That's built right into it, but they ignore it, see? Yeah, they have not really the power to do it, but the obligation to do it. The Constitution says that Congress shall regulate money and its value. And it specifically states that it must be a gold and silver coin. It's right in the Constitution. It says the Congress shall issue no bills of credit, which means it cannot issue IOUs into circulation as money, which is exactly what the Federal Reserve notes are. The Constitution forbids that. The Constitution says Congress shall not do that. Well, Congress isn't doing it, so Congress created the Federal Reserve System and says, you go do it. How is that for a trick? Yeah,
very interesting. At any rate, I believe that we've covered some pretty good ground today. Let's end with a couple announcements. Freedom Force International has something going on in Montana this year, and I believe the next Congress is the latter part of 2017. What's going on in Montana in the summer?
This is very exciting. There's that word again. It is exciting. It's called the Red Pill Expo. And of course, most people know immediately what that is all about. The red pill is drawn from the allegory made popular by the sci-fi movie called The Matrix, where all of mankind is living in an illusion, and there are a few humans that are trying to wake up their fellow citizens or their fellow humans to break out of the matrix and see life the way it really is, that nothing that they think is happening is real. And boy, if that doesn't apply to the present world in which we live, I don't know what does. So the object is to give anybody that wants to see reality a chance to do so by taking a red pill. Now, they can choose. If they take the blue pill, they'll go right back into their fantasy, their illusions, and never know any better and never have any anguish, no frustrations or anything like that. But they also wouldn't have any freedom and wouldn't have any sense of reality of any kind. So you have to take a choice. And in the movie, as in real life, some people choose the blue pill. They don't want to know. They would rather just continue in the illusion because it's comfortable and they're used to it. And in reality, there might be, they might have to do something. They might have obligation. They might have worries, you see. So some people, many people choose the blue pill in real life because they don't want the rigors of reality. But some, a minority, will choose the red pill because they want to know. They want to know what it's all about. Okay, there's the allegory. And that's what the Red Pill Expo is going to be up in Bozeman, Montana. And it's going to be in June. I hope everybody will sort of mentally mark their calendar, June 23rd, and come to our website, which is freedomforceinternational.org. freedomforceinternational.org. And just look up on the menu on the side for Red Pill Expo, and you can see all the information. In fact, you can get there more directly by going to redpillexpo.com. Forgot about that. redpillexpo.com takes you to exactly the same page, and you can see the progress. We're about to announce our first speakers, but I can't do it yet because we don't have firm agreements. But they're going to be some really important people that have some real big red pills to offer, and I just. What can I say except that we expect to find a lot of people there in Bozeman. It's a little off the beaten track. We decided consciously not to have it in Las Vegas or Atlanta or Houston or all these other big convention cities. We wanted it a little bit off the beaten track. For one thing, it'll be less expensive, but they have some great conference facilities up there. And at that time of the year, what better place of the world to be in than Big Sky Country, which is up in Montana. So people are looking forward to getting up into the open sky country and also finding out about the Red Pill Expo. So please mark your calendar and go to redpillexpo.com, and I hope to see you there.
Okay, with that, G. Edward Griffin, thanks for being with me today on this American Free Press podcast for January 2017. You have a great new year and best of luck to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mark, and good luck to you. Bye.